long-term risks for peace of mind, not trading Forex. So you mentioned then that you're seeing a lot more interest, particularly after, the pandemic and the recent election in Brazil. So that implies philosophically more and more Brazilians are looking to hedge Brazil risk, particular political risk, I guess. Okay. So then what are some of the political risks then that you see or that your clients are conveying to you that they want to hedge? It was one of the things you mentioned before we talked that you think a lot of foreigners are missing about Brazil. So what are the political risks right now?
So before I get into that, it got more accessible. Now you can download apps in Brazil and put your money in the US markets. Back in the day, you would need to have like $1 million to be able to open an account here, and we're very proud to be part of this change. Back in 2015, 16, we were one of the first financial advisors to offer interactive brokers for clients, for example. At interactive brokers, you can open, accounts for $10, $100, So accessibility became, I think, technology, But jumping into what you have just asked me about, what are these risks? So I've done hundreds of, lives, and I've been interviews with known figures for, the Brazilian markets. I never bring a script with me. But here today, I'm not talking to Brazilians, I'm talking to foreign investors. And I wanted to make it more of a script thing so then people can follow the line of thought. So first point, and I'm going to go through the first point kind of like faster because it's from a foreigner, it's not that big of a deal. But for local Brazilians, it is. There's like a quarrel going on between the Supreme Court and the legislative power, right? It got to a situation, it's because of the last government. Like Bolsonaro, he was an outsider. He wasn't a liberal. And, you have to understand that if you're investing in emerging markets, controlling the tax revenue money from those that are in the government, side of the economy, it's where the real power is, right? So when people talk about privatizing companies, usually those that are center left and left in these emerging markets economies, they're against because they're losing tax revenue and other types of revenues that they can control, right? So there should be power in Brazil to control some of Bolsonaro's liberal ideas, like privatizing couple companies, started to use amendments to transform things that could be voted on the Congress. Like a week before, a month before things go to be voted, they would use amendments to transform things into unconstitutional things. So basically, the Supreme Court started to legislate, right? That's how it started. And then, you had some other episodes of turmoil, protesting, and then we fall into this new, like, 1984 situation in Brazil in which it's not of the interest for the congressmen and senate men and the Supreme Court judges that people are able to protest or, comment about political things on social media or even like WhatsApp groups, right? So you have this kind of like Chinese style of country that Brazil is becoming. So many people were scared of Brazil going towards like a Venezuelan path with Lula's re-election. I don't think that's a main reason of concern, at least for now. I think it's more like a Chinese state-controlled thing. So there's a lot of power right now in the hands of, the Supreme Court, and a lot of power in the hands of the center and left power, right? And they're going over, increasing tax revenues and trying to, scale back some companies that were privatized, like Eletrobras. They want to go back and make it public again, and, things like that. But I don't think Brazil will become the next Venezuela, because to consolidate the power like they did in Venezuela, you need to own the political means, and you need to own the military means. And Brazil is such a big country compared to Venezuela. Like Venezuela would be the size of a state in Brazil. Yeah. And there's a lot of power in Brazil centered across different types of industries.
The economy is more diversified, right? So you have more centers of power, whereas Venezuela or even Argentina are more single cities or petro economy, right? So Brazil...
Exactly. You have a lot of power from the agriculture side of the economy in the Midwest and North region and even South. You have a lot of power from the industrial industrialists, Southeast and South, and you have a lot of power from the financial conglomerates too. So and each one has their own lobby, and this is very powerful in Brasilia. Like these guys, many of the political discussions that are going on and change of regulation, that's the main reason why, the country will never develop fast as like other countries in Asia, for example, because if you disrupt one of these industries with a new company, they will just change the regulation, and it's like a business of either they will buy your company and you're out of the game, but you're not going to take over any industry in Brazil. It's made to be, belong to oligopolies and stuff like that. It's been like that for 500 years, and some things are not meant to change, So if the country gets too poor, and because of some crazy socialism or something like that, there's just no money to keep the ball rolling, So I don't think that's a short-term risk. But a short-term risk, in my opinion, is this fight for power, either from the Supreme Court and from the new elected government. It's getting to a higher level, right? So there's still some opposition in Brazil, and they're trying to to stop the Supreme Court with some amendments, but it's such a bad spiral, like an eternal loop, because lots of guys that are now even the leaders of Congress and Senate, these guys have always been indicted of corruption in the past. So who can judge them? Well, the Supreme Court, right? And so who has the power to stop the Supreme Court from legislating and influencing things that they're not supposed to? Well, the Senate and the Congress. So it just will never get solved. And it's bad for productivity. Exactly. It's bad for productivity. It's bad from a legal point of view, meaning like any law can be changed. So let's say you're a foreign investor, you're trying to open a plant in Brazil, like an industrial plant. Well, you don't know if they're going to change, again, the taxation laws, the labor laws, or something like that. So these things interfere in these types of, juridical, legal things. And that just pushes away investors, locally, domestic investors. So lots of wealthy entrepreneurs in Brazil, they're looking at this whole quarrel situation, and that creates so much instability that, people just think, well, why would I risk my money here investing, trying to open a new venture or something like that? If even the past is uncertain in Brazil, if things change from day to night, and there's this whole war going on in between who has more power, right? So it just pushes away healthy investments. It pushes away productivity. Even farmers that made a lot of money in the last 10, 15 years are starting to look at the situation and saying, well, maybe it's time to start, selling farms and putting my money in dollars, pushing my money outside of Brazil, and just trying to create, like some wealth outside of the country, because I don't know where this is going to end, right? But it can be good too, depending on how it unfolds in the next years, because if the fight gets really, tough among them, that can be a sign of weakness, and that could open the door for good changes. But I wouldn't say that this is the biggest probability. So point number one, asking your question, I think it's this situation going on with the Supreme Court, right? That's a bad sign. Other countries that went through these problems, they didn't have a good future after, But the second problem, and I think this is one that affects more the point of view, that's more oriented for a market point of view, right? I think it's the probability of uncontrolled fiscal expenses ahead. The current party, every time they had power, and every state that they had power, these guys, they've always had problems to respect fiscal expenses. Not because they like to spend money in infrastructure, but because, controlling tax revenue and spending tax money, it's how you sustain your place in power, especially in a country like Brazil, right? So right now, raising fiscal expenses and raising taxes will make a lot of money flow through the webs of ministries and industries, and will probably benefit financially people that are in these networkings and, powerful people that are inside this type of structure. So, spending more money and raising more money for the point of view of, foreign investors is good, right? Like the country has higher tax revenue and the and the fiscal expenses are still kind of under control because these things take a little more time to go out of control. So in the beginning, it seems like something positive, right? But I don't think the way the money is being taxed and the way the money is going to be invested is oriented to productivity. You understand my point here? It's not like, oh, look at this niche here in the economy, let's develop more railroads or whatever to make things flow. No, if you want to develop a railroad because you have a farm, well, good luck trying to get interest from the government. Might as well try to do it yourself, right? I think I saw one of your episodes where a guy was actually talking exactly about it.
Yeah. Well, Pedro, the
But
NECA.
now we're falling into a different problem too for the future, Patrick, because the country now has an older demographic pyramid. So Brazil has a similar demographic pyramid like the US. The country is already indebted. It has always had a problem of low productivity because of anti-business laws, especially on labor side, right? Bureaucratic issues, that's a Portuguese heritage that Brazil has. So if this new fiscal cycle goes in the same direction as it has been historically when the same parties were in power, I think the margin that will be left to scale it back for a better situation will be too small, because now, especially after what happened last month for the services industry, for example, Brazil is a poor country that will have one of the highest taxes in the world. So we're talking about old people, high levels of debt, low productivity, bureaucracy, bad laws for those who want to invest, and high taxes. So, if things go wrong, how can you try to make it better in a country where discussing cutting taxes is like a capital sin for those in power?
So let's clarify. Let's clarify a little bit that last month, what you're talking about is that Brazil officially passed a raise to the sales tax, which would make Brazil have the highest sales tax of anywhere in the world. Is that correct?
That's correct. And not only that, they're changing the way people will pay their taxes. So they're starting next year to add increments of 1%. And most importantly, and that's what we were discussing before, right? They're creating a fourth branch of the government, unofficial fourth branch of the government. For me, that's the biggest issue. And it's going to take 3 or 4 years probably for investors to realize how unproductive this is. But starting next year, who's going to define which municipalities, which states, which government branches will receive the distribution of money coming from taxation, from revenues, right? From tax revenues? Well, let me break the news. It's going to be decided by a group of people in Brasilia, So let me be clear. Other countries that try to create a branch of the government where just a few people decide where the money is going to flow to after it's, received by the government, did not have a good path ahead after this change was made. And that's what happened in Brazil, right? So not only the highest service tax in the world, the IVA, but also creating this fourth branch. Of course, they're not going to say it's an official fourth branch, but, informally, people here are saying, it's the parliament, So if you look at the historical cases of corruption and other things, not only in Brazil, but in other countries from Latin America, giving this amount of power to a group of people doesn't seem like a good idea. And well, it's been approved. So, but talking about short term, there's nothing going on that would concern me. Like Brazil has been having good export numbers. According to Morgan Stanley, a study by Morgan Stanley that I've read a couple weeks ago, it says that Brazil is more influenced by Chinese investments than Chinese demand. differently from like, I don't know, South Korea or Indonesia, for example. And, Chinese economy is not doing so well right now, but they have been investing for industries there. The industrial side of their economy has been actually receiving investments from the government. So that's also like positive for Brazil, talking about like a macro perspective and how things can get connected. So for the short term, I think it's all right, but it's just complicated for the intermediary kind of window, which is 2, 3, 4 years from now. I think this fiscal side of the government and how they control that is just go out of control. And then lastly, I would finalize this important part of the podcast mentioning the central bank independence. So I would argue that this was one of the biggest wins of the last government, giving the central bank independence. And because, back in the day, the government would influence the central bank to reduce rates. And that's the same sad story for every Latin American economy that has problems. It's because of, government influencing things such as reserve control and interest rates control. So Bolsonaro and his government, I think that they did a very good job for the future by giving the central bank independence. However, I think this independence may die slowly. There has already been a lot of pressure on current central bank president, Roberto Campos Neto, and he's been elected by the legislative power. And he has 4 years mandate, right? And this creates more stability, less populism, and just like Fed and Congress here in the US, right? But for the next 3 years, the current government will be able to switch 10 I think out of 11 directors, they'll be able to change 10 directors. So basically, they will just put the elected president of the central bank surrounded by people that were finger pointed by people from the Socialist Party to go back to the old ways of using the central bank for, populism and things like that. And that's how it is. They already started picking names and guys that are aligned with their interest, and you see some senators and some Congress people aligned with the current government making a lot of complaints about how high the interest rates are in Brazil and how it hurts the economy. But that's the problem that they created in the beginning of 2010, and that's why Brazil had a really bad recession in 2016 when the rest of the world was doing well. So the government wants to reduce rates, and this can be a potential risk for foreign investors, because if they force the situation and they don't have control on the fiscal side of the economy, then we're talking about currency devaluation, especially for a country that imports a lot of goods. And so a devalued currency and a fiscal deficit out of control will just attract inflation, because, Brazilians import items more than they export, with the exception of agricultural items, right? So even toothpaste is imported in Brazil. So that just creates more inflation. It's completely different than the situation here, I would say, in the US. But for the short term, what is the government trying to do? What they did in 2002, what they did in 2006, what they did in 2010. And it worked in the beginning. It's that typical, expand credit, show growth, GDP will go up because they're spending money. They're giving people credit to, for consumption. And the GDP in Brazil is very similar to here in the US, which like 2/3 of the GDP is based on consumption. So giving people credit, making the government spend money. In the short term, it's a bonanza, right? You will see Brazil growing at rates that no other countries in the same region are probably going to grow, with the exception of Guyana, which is a very interesting situation going on right now. And then, that's how the current government thinks. But within time, the bill will come, like you can't do that in the short term thinking that it's going to work for many, many years. And those are things that will raise the GDP in the short term, but will put the country in a bad situation for the long term again. So history doesn't repeat itself, but yeah, it tends to rhyme. So just to summarize for those that are watching, I think that's the most important part that I've had written here. You have lack of faith in the Supreme Court and legislative powers. You have a setup that is perfect for the current government to control tax revenues and spend it however they want it for their own purposes. And within a couple of years, you also have a setup to push the central bank back to populism, right? So this is not a good recipe. And the country is now with an older demographic pyramid and, already has higher levels of debt, already has a lot of expense. And then, the constitution in Brazil says that everything should be guaranteed by the government, but it doesn't say how. It's different here than the US where, well, there's no money in the budget, everything stops and that's it. In Brazil, it never stops. So those are genuine concerns by clients of mine when they look at the situation in Brazil and they're thinking about sending their money outside of Brazil. So why would you outside of Brazil be looking to